So today we're going to continue talking about marine sedimentation. And actually I'm going to go back over some of the stuff I did on Monday because for whatever reason I was not terribly coherent, I don't think. And I know that I was putting everybody in the front row to sleep. So I'll try to make it a little more interesting this time. I won't cover all the exact same stuff in the same detail, but hopefully it'll be a bit more interesting and make a little more sense this time. Okay, so on Monday we talked about different ways you could classify sediments. And one of the first things we talked about was simply classifying sediment according to what size particles make it up. So one can make a much finer list than this, but for very coarse, rough categories could be gravel or pebbles, coarse material, larger than a few millimeters, anything from sort of pea size to golf ball size to boulder size to house sized. Sand of order millimeter, you probably already have a sense of what sand looks like. Silt, material that is fine-grained enough that it's difficult to see individual particles, but you can certainly feel them if you rub it between your fingers. Clay, which has particles that are so small even that it's difficult to feel them or taste them. And the basic idea is that this grain size classification actually has implications for the transportation and deposition of a sediment. So that the coarser grain materials, by and large, are the hardest to move around. So things like pebbles and boulders require relatively fast flow to move, or a mass wasting process where you just have rocks running downhill by themselves without really any other flow around them, but some fairly energetic process is necessary to move them around. Sand grains, being smaller, don't actually require as much energy to be moved. So even a relatively calm surf, a gentle river current can move them pretty easily. And then finally clays, which tend to actually stay in suspension in the water column, so they can be transported the largest distances by even very gentle flow regimes. Okay, and I showed you this movie of an example of sorting during flow. In this case, this is a debris flow running through a water-filled tank. And even though this material is still moving, okay, we have a segregation of coarse grain material at the bottom and fine grain material at the top. So we talk about sorting, whether you have particles that are all the same size, and we talk about average grain size, large versus small, as indications of the energy of the flowing water or air to transport these particles. In addition, the distance over which they've been transported, or the amount of time over which that flow has been active to sort out particles according to size. Okay? And this is generally true. This is actually how we interpret sediments. If we find a sediment that's sand that's all very uniform in size, we infer that moderate energy flow environment, and that energy has been consistent over some long period of time or some large distance, so that material has been winnowed out. But in fact, you can separate particles pretty effectively even on a much smaller time and length scale. And to show that, we'll do a little experiment on our own. Okay, so there we go. So I have some water. This is not flowing water, and hopefully it won't flow, because that would mean I'd knocked it over and would get in trouble. And we have some very poorly sorted sediment. And you can't see it because the bucket's kind of translucent, but maybe if I see. So you can see that there's sort of a mixture of gravel and finer grain material. There's actually some silt. It was dusty when I poured it out, so there's material that's so fine it's getting suspended in the air. And of course, there are also some pebbles in there that are a centimeter or two in size. So this is very similar, hopefully, to the picture I showed you on Monday of sort of a characteristically poorly sorted sediment. Okay, all different grain sizes mixed together. Implication being that, well, if you were to find a sediment sample that looked like this, that was natural and wasn't stirred up by me, you would infer that this had been not transported a very large distance, or had been in a very irregular energy regime where all kinds of particles were getting jumbled up together. But it turns out, if this works, you don't have to do much to it to sort these particles out. They kind of want to get sorted out. And so you just take 30 or 40 centimeters of water. That's not very much water. and just let things fall through it. Let's see what happens, and if I can do this without making a giant mess. Okay. So let this calm down for a second, and then I'll see if we can get a good video picture of it. That kind of worked. So first of all, you can see that there is some obvious sorting that's happened right away, particularly if I turn on the stage lights. Okay, that this stuff is, the water is no longer pure water, obviously. It is quite dark, and that's because there is material still suspended in it. So some of the finest grained stuff, presumably, is still actually floating around in the water. It hasn't settled to the bottom yet. And hopefully, even those of you towards the back can see that there's some stuff that's a different color at the bottom, but you may have trouble seeing what it actually is. Let's see if I can get a picture of it. There we go. Okay. So I'll show you some better pictures on, closer up pictures on Friday, but hopefully you can already see that you can see individual particles down here towards the bottom. Okay. And as you go farther up, it gets harder and harder to make out the individual materials. And in fact, what you're seeing is that we have just over the course of one graduated cylinder's worth of water, we've fairly effectively sorted out material so that the coarsest stuff is at the bottom and it gets progressively finer towards the top. The actual surface of the sediment layer that's already settled out is up here. And it very quickly gets to a point where you can't see individual particles anymore. So even a little bit of water can fairly efficiently sort out sediments from the coarsest, the fastest to fall out, the most difficult to transport, falling to the bottom, to the finest and easiest to transport, and most reluctant to come out of suspension in water towards the top. And of course, there's still plenty of sediment that's suspended in the water column itself that will come out over a period of weeks or months. In fact, I'll move this to your lab and you'll be able to see it slowly clear up over a considerable period of time. It can take the entire length of class, basically, for that water to clear up just from having some sediment and clay put in it. It takes a long time for that stuff to settle. And you'll actually work with this in your lab next week a little bit, too. I would encourage you to come up after our lecture and take a closer look. It is a bit more impressive up close than it is on the video. It's also heavy. Okay. So coarse materials, most difficult to transport, tend to settle out most quickly. Finer grained materials settle out more slowly. And that's true not just in stagnant water, but also in flowing water, which makes life relatively simple. Okay. So in addition to classifying sediments according to what size they are and how difficult they are to transport, and by inference how long or for what length of time they've been transported by their sorting, we can also classify sediments according to origin, terrigenous sediments coming from erosion of sediments, from erosion of rocks on continents, erosion of rocks on volcanoes, biogenous sediments, which are ultimately coming from a biological source, hydrogenous sediments, which are precipitated more or less directly from seawater, and cosmogenous sediments coming ultimately from some extraterrestrial source or from an impact event influenced by something that's not of the Earth. Okay, so this would be your typical beach sand in Los Angeles is a good example of a terrigenous sediment. This is actually a terrigenous sediment. It's all chunks of granite and sand from continental rocks for the most part. Biogenous sediments, shells, shark's teeth. Okay. Hydrogenous sediments, we came up with the example of sodium chloride, crystalline salt that you get from evaporating seawater. And we'll also see some other examples of that later in today's lecture. And then finally, cosmogenous sediments, which we'll see some dramatic examples of later in today's lecture. So terrigenous sediment sources, probably this basic process is familiar to you. We have mountains, they're eroded by rain, creating sand and gravel and clay, and those particles are transported by rivers out to the seashore. Since rivers flow faster with more energy than the ocean itself as a whole, and generally sediments don't make it very far once they get to the margin of the ocean, and they tend to drop out. And in fact, you can see in this picture of the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta in Bangladesh, a river choked with sediment. So choked with sediment, it's brown, okay, transitioning into clearer ocean water, in part as sediments are falling out. And so we might expect if we were to drill a hole right about here, we would see a big pile of sediments that have been worn off the Indian subcontinent and the Himalaya. And so from this basic idea of how terrigenous sediment makes it to the ocean in the first place, we ought to be able to make some inferences about where it's going to be found in the ocean. In particular, you're going to find sediments terrigenous sediments near places where terrigenous sediment is being delivered to the ocean in the first place. So in areas like river deltas. Okay? And these are mostly going to build up on the continental shelves where those rivers meet the ocean. And then we've talked about debris flows and submarine canyons and turbidity flows, which you'll also look at in your next lab, which can transport those some distance offshore from the continental shelf down the continental slope and onto the continental rise. And so in those environments, you often see materials that have been transported by gravity flows, turbidites or debris flows in one way or another. Okay? And so if we look at where is the sediment coming from, terrigenous sediment, okay, this is a map of the Earth. This is borrowed from a fairly old paper, but I think it's still good enough for our purposes. And the sizes of the arrows along the coastlines here indicate how much terrigenous sediment is being delivered to the seashore. Okay, and the arrows are roughly located near rivers, but not always. Okay, so where are the biggest arrows here? Where is the biggest source of terrigenous sediment to the ocean? How about in the New World? Or South America? In particular, what feature is here? This is where the mouth of the Amazon River is. Okay, the Amazon River is a huge river, drains a lot of the eastern slope of the Andes Mountains, these big volcanic mountains, brings lots of sediment out to the seashore. Okay, and if we go to the Old World, in particular, lots of sediment being delivered to the ocean near the Himalayas, Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta, the Mekong Delta in Southeast Asia, some other rivers along the east coast of Asia and China, the Yangtze River, and of course in Indonesia, many volcanoes, lots of rain. Okay, so rain and mountains or volcanoes, that's kind of big rivers, that's kind of the recipe for large-scale sediment delivery to the ocean. So where should we expect to find the biggest piles of sediment accumulating on the seafloor? Well, it's going to be in the same places. If we go here, or even here, we should expect to see over millions of years the development of large sediment piles. So if we just look at a map of, in this case, color-coded by the thickness of sediments on the sea floor, it's a very non-random map. Ooh, I did it again. It's a very non-random map. In fact, there is a highly systematic accumulation of sediments in a few places on the planet, and those places are almost exclusively near the continents themselves. And so hopefully this is reminding you of those arrows we saw. Big pile of sediment near the Ganges River exit into the Indian Ocean. Pretty big pile of sediment where the Amazon River reaches the Atlantic Ocean. Lots of sediment in the Gulf of Mexico, and so on. In fact, if you look at the color scale, which is a little bit tough to see, I know, from the back of the room just because of the size of the image, these reddish colors indicate piles of sediment that are more than 10,000 meters thick, more than 10 kilometers thick, okay? Or more than the distance from here to the Santa Monica Pier, except straight down, and all filled up with sediment of one kind or another, okay? And so we have some gigantic piles of sediment in the ocean right up against the continental margin. And in fact, we can essentially identify the biggest pile of mud on the planet, which is perhaps this area where the Ganges and Brahmaputra rivers deliver sediment from the Himalayas to the Indian Ocean. And you can see what the deep seafloor looks like here. Okay, this is what the color coding is, of order of 5 kilometers deep, something like that, typical abyssal plain, where you have oceanic crust without a whole lot of sediment on it. But this whole area, an area bigger than India, okay, the surface is sitting a kilometer, 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers, 4 kilometers higher than you would expect oceanic crust itself at that age to be sitting. And that extra thickness is just a giant pile of sediments. Okay, so huge piles of sediments accumulating in the Bay of this time. So let's look at the other types of sediments, none of which accumulate in the same volume as triginous sediments. Triginous sediments really dominate in terms of volume, in terms of mass. But depending on where you are in the ocean, other types of sediment can be very important. And of course, we're interested in them because we're interested in other things besides just how much sediment there is. And the next most important type are biogenous sediments in terms of volume and also in terms of general interest. And for the most part, when we talk about biogenous sediments, this isn't exclusively true, but for the most part, when we talk about biogenous sediments, we're talking about the relatively durable hard parts or skeletal or shell material from plankton. Okay? Organisms, as we'll learn later in the class, plankton are organisms that drift in the ocean. And many of them, for various reasons, will create shells, either for protection or control their buoyancy or do other functions. And when those organisms die, okay, the organic material may disappear, may not, but the hard parts tend to be durable, and they may actually survive long enough to settle to the seafloor, even though in many cases they're very small. Here's a scale bar. This little white bar here indicates a distance of 2 millionths of a meter, 2 times 10 to the minus 6 meters. So we can see this particular part of a shell, I think from a coccolithophore, is only 6, 7, 8 millionths of a meter across. What kind of sediment would that be classified as if we use the grain size classification? Say it's 6 microns across, 6 millionths of a meter. Who votes for gravel? Who votes for sand? Who votes for silt? Who votes for clay? Oh, wow. If it's 6 microns, it would actually be silt. So the cutoff I gave you is 4 microns, 4 millionths of a meter. So this would actually qualify as a very small silt-sized particle. But it's close. It's kind of on the border a little bit. Okay. We're going to talk about 2 basic divisions of skeletal material because most skeletal material falls into these 2 types. There are calcareous skeletal materials made out of calcium carbonate, CaCO3. Ca means calcium, C is carbon, O is oxygen, in crystalline form of one kind or another. And then there are siliceous skeletal materials, which aren't actually crystalline, but are made out of SiO2, silica, the dominant material in glass. Okay? And so you can think of these skeletons as being a sort of hydrated glass. Although they're not made by melting sand, they have a similar chemical composition and actually a lack of crystalline structure, which we associate with glass. So you can, of course, come up with other kinds of skeletal material that don't fit into either of these categories, including, by the way, us. Okay? Our bones are made out of phosphate. They're not made out of calcium carbonate. They're not made out of silica, that's for sure. Okay? But it turns out that vertebrates actually don't amount to much in terms of the amount of skeletal material being delivered to the seafloor. These 2 types really dominate, okay, and particularly from microscopic organisms. So the first type, calcareous biogenous sediments, largely come from plankton, although it can also come from larger shelled organisms and even from coral reefs. That's another form of calcareous sediment. Okay, but the 2 major types we're going to talk about, we're going to come back to this when we start talking about biology in more detail, are foraminiferans and coccolithophores. Both of these organisms make their skeletons or tests out of calcium carbonate. Okay. Foraminiferans are a little bit like amoebas, and they kind of move into successfully bigger chambered shells, which have these little holes in it, which I think is where the name foraminiferan comes from. Foramen is like a hole. That's a fancy Latin word for hole, I think. And coccolithophores have these shells that are sort of an agglomeration of these disc-shaped things, which are coccoliths. Okay? And they're much smaller. Okay? The scale bar here, this gray bar, is a distance of about 250 millionths of a meter, 2.5 times 10 to the minus 4 meters, a little bit less than 1 millimeter in size. So these would be sand grains. Okay? You can see them with your naked eye, at least the bigger ones like this. Chalcolithophores are tiny, tiny, tiny. This one is about 10 millionths of a meter across, again in the silt-sized category. And in fact, the picture I was showing you before, I think, is one of these things from not the same species, but the same basic type of organism. Okay? And it turns out that this organism is animal-like. It consumes other organisms to make its living. Chalcolithophores are actually primary producers. You can think of them as being somewhat analogous to plants. They do photosynthesis in the ocean. When we talk about siliceous plankton, there are also a couple types that really are sort of dominant in the modern ocean, at least. Diatoms and radiolaria. And I showed you another picture of radiolaria in the first slide for this lecture. And so these are shells made out of SiO2. It has water incorporated in the structure, and it's not crystalline. It's more like a glass, kind of. And these organisms are, particularly diatoms, fabulously abundant in our oceans, perhaps the most important photosynthesizing organisms in the ocean. Radiolaria, much like foraminiferans, are consumers. They eat other organisms to make their living. Okay, but they both make shells of SiO2. Okay, so all these types of shells I've shown you, foraminiferans, chalcolithophores, diatoms, and radiolaria, these are all examples, at least the ones I've showed you, of planktonic organisms, organisms that make their living drifting in the ocean. And two of those types of organisms, the chalcolithophores and the diatoms, are photosynthesizers. Okay, and we're going to learn this in more detail later, but what do you need to do photosynthesis? You need sunlight. You need what else? Sorry? Photosynthesis actually makes oxygen. You need CO2, and you also need nutrients. Okay, if you're going to grow a garden, you usually put fertilizer in it, certain trace chemical compounds that help organisms grow and do photosynthesis. It turns out that many of the same nutrients are important for determining how abundant life is in the ocean, but just from the fact that those are photosynthesizing organisms, we can say right away, aha, these must be organisms that, by and large, live up near the top of the ocean, the part that sunlight penetrates into, top 100 meters or 200 meters or so, depending on where you are. Okay, so these are organisms that are, by and large, abundant in the surface ocean. And, of course, organisms that eat other organisms are going to tend to hang out where those other organisms live. So it turns out that the surface ocean, by and large, is the most densely populated part of the ocean. Okay. So both calcareous and siliceous shells are produced generally most quickly in the greatest abundance in surface waters in the ocean. Now it turns out that deep ocean water dissolves calcium carbonate. It's soluble, okay? It's particularly soluble when you have an acid. And it turns out that deep ocean water is more acidic than surface water. Siliceous shells, like the radiolaria and diatoms, actually the ocean is pretty much everywhere undersaturated with respect to SiO2, which means if you throw SiO2 into the ocean, it will start dissolving pretty much everywhere in the ocean. There is no part of the ocean in which it will spontaneously precipitate out. So those skeletons, as soon as they form and the organism dies, start decaying away, start dissolving away, but they dissolve fairly slowly, and it turns out that they dissolve most quickly up near the surface, and the deeper they get, the more slowly they dissolve. Okay, so we kind of have two different types of behavior. Calcareous skeletons dissolve in deep water. Siliceous skeletons dissolve everywhere, but most quickly in surface waters, by and large. Okay. And we would expect to find lots of both types of organisms living in the surface ocean, particularly in places where there's lots of nutrients, lots of CO2, plenty of sunlight, things like phosphorus and nitrogen. Okay. And so what ends up happening is, if you look at the seafloor and the sediment that's accumulating there, okay, these organisms are living all over the place, more or less. They live in different parts of the ocean in different degrees, but in the shallow ocean, both calcareous and siliceous skeletons are being formed. But if you get into the deep water, the skeletons from the calcareous organisms actually tend to dissolve before they make it to the bottom, or while they're sitting on the bottom before they can get buried and insulated from the seawater that's dissolving them. Siliceous skeletons are dissolving everywhere in the ocean, and so in principle they can make it all the way to the bottom just as easily as they could survive at the surface. That turns out to be really important for understanding where these things occur in the ocean. Okay, so in terms of overall sediment classification, we consider a sediment to be a biologically dominated sediment or an ooze in the open ocean if it contains at least 30% biological material, roughly a third. Okay? And what controls whether a particular area of the seafloor has this concentration, that high of a concentration of biological material? Well, it's going to have to do with a few things. How quickly are those materials being produced? Is there lots of microbial activity in the surface waters? Do those shells survive to accumulate on the seafloor, or are they dissolved before they can accumulate? And are they being diluted by copious amounts of terrigenous material that's coming in? It doesn't matter how productive the ocean is, if there's a big river delivering tons and tons of gravel and sand from the continents, you're never going to have 30% biogenous sediment because there's always so much terrigenous sediment mixed into it. Okay? And for that reason, particularly because of dilution, these oozes are relatively uncommon near continental margins, okay? Because there's usually a bigger supply of terrigenous material, and that just dominates everything. Okay? There may be plenty of organisms living there, but there's so much terrigenous material coming in that it just gets diluted. Okay? They're also relatively uncommon in places where there's just not much biological activity. So if you're in a particular part of the ocean that just doesn't have very much biological activity going on, particularly because there aren't very many nutrients, but you could also think of, let's say, you're living near one of the poles, and you're in the winter, so the sun never makes it up. There's not going to be a whole lot of photosynthesis going on. You may at least seasonally not have very much formation of new biological material either. And this is, by the way, just a nice picture, a photomicrograph of a biological ooze. Can anybody recognize any of the organisms whose shells are represented here? I've showed you pictures of the most common things here, but not exactly the same. I think this is a radiolarian. So this is an SiO2 skeleton. And I think these things that look like little pills or sweet tarts, those are diatoms by and large. So this would probably be, for the most part, a siliceous ooze, but there are some calcareous organisms. This thing and this thing are probably foraminiferans. So it's a mixed one. Okay, so I've told you that calcium carbonate tends to dissolve, particularly in deep water. So if we look at what kinds of sediments are accumulating today at the bottom of the ocean, we should expect to see some correlation of type with depth. And I'm sorry, this is a weird looking image. I tried to find a better one, and I eventually did, but it was kind of too late to stick in, so this is what we're working with. So this is a map of the world's oceans. You can see the outlines of the continents. And the color coding of all these little dots that are kind of plastered one up against the other is reflecting the percentage of calcium carbonate in the sediments that are accumulating at the seafloor. They're at the very top of the sediment that have accumulated most recently. And the bluish colors indicate very little carbonate, less than 10% or even less than 1%. And the orangish and eventually whitish and reddish colors indicate dominantly calcium carbonate sediments. So looking at this map, can anybody see a correlation? What features of the seafloor seem to be associated with lots of calcium carbonate? Abyssal plains. So there's an abyssal plain here. There's an abyssal plain here. You're right, there's a correlation with abyssal plains, but it actually goes the other way. You tend not to find calcium carbonate skeletons in areas that are abyssal plains, particularly in the Pacific Ocean. But there is a feature of the seafloor that does tend to have lots of carbonate associated with it. Yes, the mid-ocean ridges. Mid-Atlantic ridge runs right down here. Here's where the East Pacific rises in the Pacific Ocean, and there's an Indian ridge that runs up like this. And those all tend to be areas where there's lots of carbonate accumulating. Okay? Ridges tend to stand high. So that's areas where the water isn't quite as deep. These calcium carbonate skeletons are sitting relatively high on the seafloor. They don't have to settle as far. They're less likely to dissolve there. Okay? And this idea that if you get too deep in the ocean, calcium carbonate skeletal material from these microbial organisms tends to dissolve before it can accumulate and make a calcareous sediment. And there's kind of a depth, which varies somewhat from place to place, but is roughly 4 or 5 kilometers deep on average. Below that depth, calcium carbonate skeletons don't accumulate. You don't get calcium carbonate-rich sediments. Above that depth, you can. And since mid-ocean ridges are typically 2.5 or 3 kilometers deep, that's above this calcite compensation depth, this calcium carbonate compensation depth. And so materials can accumulate there without dissolving. Once you get below that depth, they tend to dissolve before they can accumulate. So the deep Pacific and the deepest abyssal plains in the Atlantic Ocean also tend to be relatively carbonate-free. Mid-ocean ridges tend to be rich in carbonates. Okay? So if we look at a cross-section, and this is actually kind of a funny cross-section, so it's going from the North Atlantic down to Antarctica, so that's North Pole, South Pole, and then it goes actually back north again. So you can think of this as being a stripe all the way from Greenland, around Antarctica, and then up through the Pacific Ocean, almost all the way around the planet. And what we see is that the high-standing parts of the seafloor in much of the Atlantic Ocean are accumulating calcium carbonate sediments. When you get into the Pacific, only areas that really stand fairly high above the seafloor actually accumulate calcium carbonate. And we can actually draw a line that delineates parts of the ocean that are too deep for calcium carbonates to accumulate and call it the CCD, or the calcium carbonate compensation depth. Your book calls it the calcite compensation depth, which is probably technically more correct. Turns out that there's another kind of calcium carbonate called aragonite. Actually, there's several types, which has a slightly different depth of dissolution because it's less stable. But for the purposes of this class, we can just call it either calcite compensation depth or calcium carbonate compensation depth, and you'll have no problems. Okay, and that's calcium carbonate accumulating in shallow parts of the ocean, not accumulating in deep parts of the ocean, because it tends to dissolve there before it can accumulate. Okay, so here's the basic idea. I've alluded to this already. Calcium carbonate actually gets dissolved in the deep ocean by reaction with acid. It turns out that our deep oceans are somewhat more acidic than the shallow parts of the ocean. There are actually other reasons. They're also really cold, which aids in the dissolution also. But the critical thing is that, in particular, carbon dioxide, which is a trace gas in our atmosphere, which we'll talk about in considerably more detail as we go on in this class, can react with water, undergoes a chemical reaction to make carbonic acid, this H2CO3 stuff. It's an acid, which means it can give off H+. That's kind of the definition of an acid. Okay? And that H+ can actually attack calcium carbonate and cause it to dissolve. In fact, if you were to take GE1, and you'll do this actually in your next lab, you'll actually test for the presence of calcium carbonate by dropping acid on things. And anything that has calcium carbonate in it, when you drop a little hydrochloric acid or any other moderately strong acid, actually will fizz because it's reacting with it so quickly. Okay? And so the more CO2 that's dissolved in water, the more acidic that water becomes, the greater its ability, its tendency to dissolve calcium carbonate becomes. And so in today's ocean, CO2 accumulates in the deep ocean because the ocean's stratified, it turns out. We'll cover this in much more detail later in the class. That makes it more acidic, and it makes it so these calcium carbonate skeletons tend to dissolve over time. If you get deep enough, they dissolve faster than they can accumulate. And so you never get calcium carbonate sediments in any significant accumulation. If you look closely at this figure, by the way, you can see that there's an asymmetry to it. The CCD is much deeper in the Atlantic Ocean. Much more of the Atlantic Ocean had those kind of reddish and yellowish colors indicating lots of carbonate in the sediment. It's much shallower in the Pacific Ocean, and particularly in the northern Pacific Ocean. So what might you infer from that? Based on the story I've just told you? Yes? Actually, that's true to a certain extent. The North Pacific does have relatively few nutrients in it. And so if you have lots and lots of carbonate material being formed, it may accumulate faster than it can dissolve, even though the water is you're dissolving it equally quickly, right? So that's actually part of the answer. It's not the entire answer, but that's a reasonable part of the answer for sure. If what's causing the calcium carbonate to dissolve is acid that's generated by the reaction of CO2 with water, and the Pacific Ocean is much more liable to dissolve calcium carbonate than the Atlantic Ocean, what can we infer about the Pacific Ocean? the deep Pacific. Does it have more CO2 or less CO2? More. In fact, this is true. By and large, deep waters in the Pacific Ocean, particularly kind of northern part of the Pacific Ocean, are relatively rich in carbon dioxide. Waters in the North Atlantic Ocean are relatively poor in carbon dioxide. And it turns out this actually tells us something about how old that water is. If we count its age as how long has it been since the water was last at the surface, relatively low CO2 abundance is characteristic of young water that's just come down from the surface and sunk to the deep part of the ocean. CO2-rich water is characteristic of water that's been submerged for a long time. It's had organic material raining down into it over long periods of time and decomposing. That decomposition process gives off CO2, and that CO2 stays in the water and accumulates over time. We're going to come back to this later in the term, but just to give you a little bit of a foreshadowing. Okay, so that's the story for calcium carbonate oozes. They tend to accumulate relatively shallow waters, area with high biological productivity, particularly in the Atlantic Ocean, where there isn't that much CO2 dissolved. Siliceous oozes are a little bit more complicated story because they are actually dissolving everywhere in the ocean. So really the only places in the ocean they accumulate are places where there's relatively high productivity on the surface. You're generating so many of these things that they're falling down to the seafloor and accumulating before they can dissolve away. Okay, so in general, most parts of the ocean, calcium carbonate organisms just outnumber silica organisms, at least once one corrects for a dissolution in shallow waters. So in particular, it's only in parts of the ocean that are so deep that the calcium carbonate skeletons have already dissolved that you see sediments that are relatively pure SiO2 biological sediments. And you have to have a lot of these organisms for them to survive and accumulate in significant amounts. So you're mainly going to find them underneath relatively nutrient-rich zones. And if I go back to this picture, okay, at first I said, oh, look at this big pile of mud, right? Look at this big pile of mud. Look at this big pile of mud. That's not all that's going on here. There's actually some more stuff that's going on here. In particular, there's an accumulation of sediment there in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And that, I believe, is largely biological sediment. It's one of the few biological sediment accumulations you can see on this map. There's some others, but this is probably the biggest one. And that actually turns out to be a function of nutrients. You're not seeing a river mysteriously dumping sediment halfway across the Pacific Ocean. You're actually seeing a part of the ocean that's been really fertile and has been fertile for a fairly long time. Okay. Now there's a special class of terrigenous sediments that's worth mentioning in this context, and that is abyssal clays. I've talked about how terrigenous sediments by and large accumulate near the margins, and by volume, by mass, that's certainly true. But there are some terrigenous sediments that actually make it well out into the ocean, the finest grained sediments by and large. And in particular, sediments that are transported not by water necessarily, but by the wind. And by things like dust storms. So this is a picture from Iraq, from a military base. What you're seeing here is a big dust storm just about to inundate the whole base. This happens several places on the planet, in general areas where we have large desert regions. So particularly prominent is West Africa, near the Sahara Desert. So Morocco, Western Sahara, and Central Asia, okay, Mongolia, the Gobi Desert. Okay, those are areas where we have broad areas, winds blow really quickly, there's not a lot of vegetation on land to hold that sediment down. It can get lofted into the air, it can actually be transported hundreds or even thousands of kilometers out to sea and accumulate, not very quickly, but relative to the accumulation rate of biological organisms, enough to actually dominate sediments in some areas if there's a source. And so you can actually see these events occurring. This is a NASA picture, I think, taken from the space shuttle, but I may be wrong. And just to get you oriented, we're looking at the northwest coast of Africa. So here's Morocco, Western Sahara, just a bit of Algeria peeking in. Here's Spain, here's Portugal. Okay, and we've had a wind event blow up dust off the Sahara Desert, which is now in this picture, well on its way across the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, and after these events, you can see funky sunsets along the east coast of the United States caused by all the dust in the air. And you can imagine all along here, this dust is settling out into the water column and eventually to the seafloor. Okay? So you can get accumulations of abyssal clay in areas where there's relatively low biological productivity, but you're kind of downwind from one of these desert regions, North Atlantic, North Pacific, okay, some areas in the southern hemisphere as well. Hydrogenous sedimentary deposits rarely dominate on the seafloor, except in a few instances, and there's one particular kind that's got a story that's worth telling. I guess this is where I'll finish for today. So these are chemical sediments that are deposited from seawater. We talked about salt as being an example of a hydrogenous sediment that you can get when you evaporate seawater. But even within cold ocean water, okay, down deep in the ocean, you can actually get precipitation of things like ferromanganese nodules. Okay, and this is a cutaway of one. Here's just a picture of a bunch of them accumulated on the seafloor near Japan, I think. And you can see it's got kind of an onion ring structure. There's maybe a fragment of shell or bone or something, and then this kind of concretion forms around it and grows outwards. And in some parts of the seafloor, these things are growing essentially cheek by jowl. These things are really weird because of what they're made out of as much as anything. They're full of iron, they're full of manganese, they're full of other strange elements, lead and thallium, that usually we don't think of as being very common in seawater. We'll get to this in the next lecture in detail. So all these strange elements that don't occur very commonly in seawater seem to precipitate out on these things. And if you had a big pile of them on land, you would actually be very happy because you could sell it as an ore, okay, an iron ore, manganese ore, other types of metal. They have value once you bring them to the surface because of the metals that are in them in particular. Now, it's a bit expensive to get things off the seafloor, of course, so it's not totally clear that you can make money at this. But people got excited about it, in particular because of Howard Hughes, who I believe in the early 70s, around the early 70s, his corporation started building a big boat. And the stated purpose of this boat was to go out and mine these things off the seafloor, okay, to recover iron manganese nodules for commercial purposes. So you can see this thing has kind of a drilling rig, and it's going to drag stuff off the seafloor. So people got really excited about possible economic recovery of iron manganese nodules from various parts of the seafloor. And there was lots of research done. There's still lots of research being done, in part because of this excitement. Because Howard Hughes is like a total genius, right? The guy made himself rich. Turns out, however, that it was a scam, okay? This actually had nothing to do with getting iron manganese nodules off the seafloor, even though that's what everybody was told was going on. Does anybody know this story? Okay, a couple of you. It was actually a CIA front. This boat was actually designed to recover a sunken Russian submarine that had been lost south of Hawaii. So this ship was solely designed to lift a nuclear submarine off the seafloor and bring it up at a special hidden door under the waterline that could actually have the submarine brought up into the ship and then close behind it. It was like something out of James Bond or something. Okay? So the idea of going and mining these nodules was actually, it was totally a made-up story. Seemed plausible enough, people got really excited about it, but it wasn't actually at all what was going on. And turns out that the mission didn't quite succeed. I think if I understand it right, the Russian submarine, they actually found it on the seafloor. They knew very well where it was. They were able to lower down cables and secure it and start bringing it up towards the surface. But just before they got it into the boat, the sub broke in two and fell right back down again. And by the time they were able to, or in a position, before they were able in a position to try again, the Russians kind of figured out what was going on, and that was kind of the end of that. This ship, by the way, still exists, even though it never really succeeded at the job for which it was designed. It's now servicing oil drilling, I think. For a long time, it was sitting in San Diego Harbor, Suisun Bay. But I think it's actually, particularly when oil got really expensive, it was recommissioned to help service oil drilling. So it's actually still going. All right, so the last type of sediments I'm going to talk about are cosmogenic sediments. And these are sediments that are in some way related to an extraterrestrial event. Perhaps the most dramatic example of an extraterrestrial event leading to sedimentary sedimentary record is the Chicxulub impact crater, which we think contributed to the Cretaceous Tertiary mass extinction. This is where the dinosaurs disappeared and lots of organisms in the ocean disappeared. It's one of the most severe extinction events in Earth's history, and it happened like that. Basically, as far as we can tell, very quickly. There was diverse ecosystems both in the ocean and on land, and then all of a sudden they were gone. And there's a period of time where there's not much of anything on Earth, and then a few organisms start to show up again in the record. In fact, you can see this. This is a picture of a drill core in the Gulf of Mexico where the boundary crops out right about here. There's a better example of this. So here's where the Chicxulub impact crater occurred in the Yucatan Peninsula. Here's Florida. Here's Louisiana, Texas coast. Okay. And what's shown over here are pictures. Unfortunately, I couldn't find them in color. The color is really cool, so I could only find black and white. This is a drill core that was taken right here, so off the east coast of Florida. This is, by the way, quite a distance away, okay? Like a couple hours airplane flight, okay, all the way across Florida. But if you look in this drill core, you can see that there's something very serious that happened over this interval of time. Okay, we have these nice, very fine-grained sediments, and then just a pile of these little beads of glass called tektites. And what we think these are molten rock that got ejected so high up into the atmosphere that it formed droplets and then fell out various places around the Earth's surface. If the impact happened here, we're looking at little beads of glass that transported themselves through the atmosphere something like 1,000 miles and then fell out of the water column. Okay? And so we can see that there's a really violent event occurs here. There's actually some charcoal in some places indicating widespread wildfires. And then after that, things start to calm down again, but there's not very much in the way of fossils above that layer for quite a while. So it's like something really bad happens, molten rock is raining out of the sky, and then it's kind of quiet. Everything is kind of gone for a while. So we'll come back on Friday. I'll finish talking about cosmogenic sediments, and we'll start talking about the chemistry and physics of seawater.